everybody. Welcome to Bharat Varta. This is Ami Ganatra, and with me here today is the author of the book The Battle of Maratha Empire, Aneesh Gokhale ji. So Aneesh Gokhale ji is actually a merchant navy professional. He's an officer in the merchant navy, and as a hobby, he writes. He writes on history. The Battle of Maratha Empire that we will discuss today is his second book. His first book is Brahmaputra, the story of Chhatrapati Khan. And today itself, there was a news which he shared that the book is going to be relaunched again next year by Bloomsbury. So, Anishji, heartiest congratulations for that, and very happy to have you here today.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
So, to directly start discussing about your book, one thing which I would love to know, Anishji, is that before Shivaji came to prominence, what was the situation in this area? What was the situation in this area? Because we do know that Shahaji Raje was in the Adil Shahi army at that time. He was a commander in the Adil Shahi forces. So what was the situation in which Shivaji Raje rose to prominence?
So to understand Chhatrapati Shivaji, we need to move to 1296 AD, almost 300 years ago. And that was the year when Alauddin Khilji attacked Maharashtra, what we today call Maharashtra and the Deccan. Was attacked in that year by Alauddin Khilji, the last surviving Hindu kingdom in western Maharashtra, in today's Aurangabad to Kolhapur region. The Yadavs of Devgiri, they tried to fight against him, but were comprehensively defeated. And 20 years later, that kingdom had completely vanished from the face of this earth. Khilji took his campaigns all the way into South India, up to Madurai in fact, and what he established was later on known as the Deccan Sultanates. So after the departure of Khilji, over 100 years later, we find that the Vijayanagar kingdom manages to rise in South India, what is today's Karnataka and Andhra Pradesh mainly. After reaching a very glorious age of 100 years, they are also defeated in the Battle of Talikota by the combined army of the various Deccan Sultanates of Adil Shahi, and there are at that point of time 4 or 5 of them, Barid Shahi and Farooq Shahi and such, which are later on subsumed among themselves. These 3 or 4 Deccan Sultanates come together and they completely crush this Vijayanagar kingdom, which then survived for a few more years deep somewhere in Tamil Nadu. But for all purposes, 1565 AD is when this comes to an end. So they survived for about 100 years. From 1565 onwards, there is no Hindu kingdom really of note in South India. And as far as Maharashtra is concerned, there has been nobody for the past 300 years because the Vijayanagar kingdom did not penetrate much into Maharashtra. So this is the milieu that Chhatrapati Shivaji is born in, that around Pune, Satara, Kolhapur, Mumbai, this region what we call heartland of Maratha history, there has been foreign rule for the past 300 years. In these 300 years, two important things take place. One is the Bhakti movement. The Bhakti movement coincides with this time period of the fall of this Hindu kingdom and the rise of Shivaji, the interim in between, because we find Sant Jnaneshwar is of the more or less same era that Alauddin Khilji has attacked, and then various others come afterwards, Sant Namdev and Tukaram and everyone, right up to Samartha Ramdas, who is known as the Guru of Chhatrapati Shivaji. And as you know, because we talk about Samartha Ramdas, obviously it means about Sri Ram, and that is again connected to Vishnu. That is one aspect about the cultural impact of the Bhakti movement. And what the Bhakti movement did was to keep people within the Hinduism fold when the invasions were happening. All this grandeur of temples and kings donating millions and millions of rupees to temples had gone away because their rule had been replaced. But a simplistic form of religion was kept alive by this Bhakti movement, and it provided the kind of spiritual base that would later on Chhatrapati Shivaji will find helpful for building up. If that had not been there, it's very difficult for Chhatrapati Shivaji to have a base to build on. Second thing was political. As you mentioned, Shahaji Raje was with Adil Shahi because their own kingdom had got wiped out. Now all these important Sardars such as Shahaji Raje and Maluji Raje before him entered the service of these various sultans, such as Adil Shahi Bijapur or the Nizam Shahi of Ahmednagar or even the Mughals. A lot of these Maratha Sardars kept rotating themselves as they saw fit for their own political survival. Shahaji Raje, in fact, tried 2 to 3 times for establishing some kind of Swarajya or self-rule. His first attempt was to rescue the Nizam Shahi had. When the Mughals and Adil Shahi attacked the Nizam Shahi in the early part of the 17th century, the Nizam Shahi had was just 7 or 8 years old. And Shahaji Raje aimed to rescue him and tried to rule through him as a puppet, but that was not successful because the Mughals eventually won. Then he tried to open two fronts. One was with Chhatrapati Shivaji, and usually we think that Shivaji Maharaj was in Pune and Shivaji Raja was in Bangalore with Adil Shah. But by being with Adil Shah, what he achieved was the capability to send officers and teachers to Chhatrapati Shivaji who could help him in build that initial nucleus, because the early years are very crucial when you are trying to build a small nucleus of good people, soldiers, forts right around Pune. The slightest mistake would have completely wiped out this entire dream. But Adil Shah was in Bangalore. Shahaji Raje, one of the foremost ministers in this court, or generals you can say. And Shahaji Raje played a crucial role in convincing Adil Shah that what Shivaji Maharaj is doing in Pune is for the good of Adil Shah. The entire Jagir of Pune was with Shahaji Raje. What is today more or less almost exactly Pune district of today. That is from Junnar to Baramati was the entire Jagir given to Shahaji Raje by Adil Shah. But the forts were with Ali Adil Shah himself. And Shivaji Raje then went and started taking these forts under his control, few of them one by one. He took Purandar, Torna without fighting. Shahaji Raja got a very strong because he was a very popular minister in the court. So he took his word. And Shahaji Raja in Bangalore, when they were asked what is happening in Pune, he was saying that Shivaji Raja is taking these forts under his wing to renovate them and make them stronger for your own defense. And he would show, see, this is all the kind of thing happening on these forts. By the time Adi Adil Shah realized what is happening, from his point of angle, the damage had already been done. That Shivaji Maharaj managed to establish nucleus or a base from which he could go on. More importantly, certain Sardars were sent by Shahaji Raja to Shivaji because he was only 16, 17 years old, maybe 18 years old at the point of time. He had absolutely no experience in, couldn't have any kind of experience in statecraft and such things. And by having these his own servants or his own deputies in and around Pune, they could advise and help Shivaji in the correct direction.
Wow, this is fascinating. It's really fascinating. So I think after this, after Adil Shah came to know that Shivaji is more than just taking care of his forts, he sent Afzal Khan. And we know this famous incident where Afzal Khan is called for a meeting and Shivaji kills him. We know that. But you talk about it in a lot more detail in the Battle of Pratapgad. And the Battle of Pratapgad was actually a lot more than just this incident, after which Shivaji became a force to reckon with in this area. So can you tell us more about the Battle of Pratapgad and why it was important for the Maratha Empire's establishment?
So as I mentioned that the small nucleus had already been created, and Ali Adil Shah then first sent one general against Chhatrapati Shivaji, believed that this would be the end of the contest. That person sent by him got defeated, and Adil Shah then realized that this is far more serious than what I believed it to be. At that point of time, in fact, this clash between Shivaji Maharaj and Ali Adil Shah might have taken place earlier itself, but between around about 1652 to about 1656, 1657, we find that the Mughals had attacked Karnataka. That is Adil Shah's kingdom. They had always a permanent dream that, especially Aurangazeb had this dream that he wanted to expand into South India, which he finally did towards the end of his life. But that same Aurangazeb, who was at the point of time around 40 years of age, attacked Adil Shah. You won't find it surprising that Afzal Khan captured Aurangazeb and he brought him to Ali Adil Shah that this is Aurangazeb, your Mughals prince. Shah Jahan's son is here. You can let's win. A nice prize you have got here. You can have whatever you want. And Adil Shah let Aurangzeb go free because he didn't want Shah Jahan standing at his door with the entire army of Hindustan. Because one thing to fight against Aurangzeb, who had some troops arranged around Aurangabad and this region, and something else to be expecting Shah Jahan come all the way from Delhi. Afzal Khan actually trapped Aurangzeb, let him go free. So around 1658, this finally fracas came to an end. Whatever treaty they signed, Mughals went there with, they went their own way. And they could now turn their attention towards Chhatrapati Shivaji with the obvious aim to capture him alive, and if that is not possible, to kill him. Only two things to be done. There was no ambiguity about the aims. Why is it important is that one is that the killing of Afzal Khan itself, because Chhatrapati Shivaji knew that Afzal Khan is fully capable of this. In fact, about 15-20 years prior to this event of Pratapgad, that in small place called Sira in Karnataka, Sira or Shira it's called, a small principality in Karnataka, was ruled by a king called Kasturi Ranganayak, 1638 or 1639. And the same Afzal Khan had gone there. He had fought a battle. He had won the battle, fair and square. After that, he had called Kasturi Ranganayak for negotiations. So you come down for negotiation, whatever you will decide, or half your kingdom or tribute, etc., and then that will be the end of the story. So obviously, once this surrender document had come, he had sworn on the Quran and all these things happened. Kasturi Ranganayak went unarmed to his meeting and he was outright killed. So that history preceded Afzal Khan, calling people for a meeting and killing them. So Shivaji Maharaj obviously could have thought along the same term that, it couldn't be me next after this Kasturi Ranganayak. Secondly, a lot of things you have to notice about the Pratapgad campaign is they bring everything about Chhatrapati Shivaji's personality to the fore. Each of those events that take place, some very interesting events take place in those 2 years, you find. One is that when Afzal Khan moves from Bijapur, that is in Karnataka, he moves from Bijapur towards Vai, and the whole aim is that to draw Chhatrapati Shivaji out towards Baramati Solapur side. But if you see towards the east of Pune, it's not very mountainous. Towards the south and west of Pune city, there are lots of hills and valleys and ravines. If you travel from Mumbai to Pune on the highway, you can see the amount of hilly region that is there. But if you go east towards Hyderabad, towards Solapur, you find that the hilly region comes quite low. It's almost a plain. So Afzal Khan's aim was to draw Chhatrapati Shivaji out into this plain area where he had his cavalry, artillery, and finished the battle. It is to Shivaji Maharaj's credit that he kept within his forts even after knowing that Afzal Khan was carrying out desecration of various places and all this to draw him out, but he did not fall for his bait. Second thing you notice is that Shivaji Maharaj decides to fight at Pratapgad, which is at the border of his territories at that point of time, rather than allow Afzal Khan to come well within his territories towards the Pune region where his stronger forts are, Rajgarh and Torna, because that would mean fighting within his territories. It's not fighting in Adil Shah's territories. Most interesting aspect of this whole campaign is that there is a timer attached to it by the Mughal Empire, by Aurangazeb. Aurangazeb at this point of time sends a khillat or a robe of honor for Chhatrapati Shivaji from Delhi. Very interesting. You find that Shivaji Maharaj is going to find Afzal Khan, and Aurangzeb sends a robe of honor from Delhi, which is addressed supposedly for Shivaji Maharaj. You join me against Adil Shah, because that nobody knows Shivaji Maharaj's capability at this point of time. Both Adil Shah and Mughal are thinking this is a good person, we can use his shoulder to fire the gun. So kind of, get something done from Shivaji Maharaj and then take all blame away from ourselves. Is the thinking on both sides, and which is why this khillat is sent. It is a very alarming situation, you can say, in Maharashtra, because once the khillat reaches, there are two options that are available. One, that khillat actually reaches Shivaji Maharaj, and then he has to do what this Aurangzeb is saying. Option two, suddenly that khillat might head towards Afzal Khan, and then it's a big problem because then Adil Shah and the Mughals have combined against him. So the whole issue has to be settled within 2 years' time, or within about 1 year's time, when that robe of honor actually left Delhi and is headed towards Satara. And Chhatrapati Shivaji manages to settle the issue within that time frame without having to grapple with this extra problem what to do that the Mughals are involved in. There are other aspects which are important, such as the action by Kanoji Jadhav. Now Afzal Khan comes and he starts distributing presents and watans and lands to everybody in Maharashtra. He says that you join me, otherwise that is the end of your story. And a lot of them actually go over towards Afzal Khan because Shivaji Maharaj is really not proven anything of note against somebody like Afzal Khan. Kanoji Jadhav is one of those people who have been deputed by Shahaji Raja earlier to protect Chhatrapati Shivaji, and his instructions are very clear that no matter what happens, Shivaji Maharaj should not face problems. This is the instruction to Kanoji Jadhav when he is sent from Bangalore, and they are of what we call the Rohida Khora, or the area around Rohida Fort in Maharashtra. So Kanoji Jadhav decides to side with Chhatrapati Shivaji at a very crucial juncture, when he knows that the victory is not anyway certain. Maybe there's a 10% chance, given Afzal Khan's own repertoire as a military commander, the chances of Chhatrapati Shivaji winning are maybe 10 or 20%. But Kanoji Jadhav at this point of time goes to Rajgarh and literally surrenders all his lands to Chhatrapati Shivaji, saying that I'm not going to join him, you can take my lands from me. It has such an electrifying effect that a senior commander like Kanoji Jadhav has relinquished his lands to Chhatrapati Shivaji and declared publicly that he will not join Afzal Khan. It stops any and all kinds of defections that are going to happen henceforth, and which is why Chhatrapati Shivaji is able to keep much of his army together. And there are other aspects such as the troop disposition, which is very detailed, very nicely marked up. And finally, the most important part comes to the reaction that is done after the killing of Afzal Khan. There is a beautiful essay by by Narhar Kurundkar called How Small Was Shivaji? This Marathi translation of the essay is supposed to be the original preface for a very popular Marathi book called Shriman Yogi. And he makes a statement that Hindu powers, if you talk about Hindu powers, it's not that they lost all the time, but they won also sometimes. But it's very critical to examine this point that in defeat they faced complete annihilation, and in victory it was a case of status quo. So whenever the Hindu powers won, it was status quo. Or whatever the enemy was, he remained that. And when they were defeated, that was the end of the story. And we can see throughout history that this has happened multiple number of times. There are some exceptions here and there, but by and large, the history was correct. And right after Pratapgad, Chhatrapati Shivaji showed a complete contrast to this by invading Adil Shah. That's why it took himself to Pratapgad, right at the border. And when Afzal Khan was killed, he did not return from there back to Rajgarh, but continued southwards all the way up to Kolhapur, which is almost 2 districts further, and showed that defeat of Afzal Khan resulted not just in killing of Afzal Khan, but a net negative outcome for the Adil Shahi kingdom. And from that point on, Shivaji Maharaj was taken very, very seriously across not just Maharashtra but India itself.
Aneesh, why did he side with Shivaji? Shivaji was, as you said, the chances of winning were very small, 10 to 15%. Then what made him join forces with Shivaji instead of Afzal Khan?
So Shivaji Maharaj actually had finally spoken about this dream called Swaraj. Nobody had even dreamt about it, and here was a good chance that it already been progress, because you can see from the time Shivaji Maharaj took control of his first fort, you can say Swaraj building already started, and it was a dream that Shahaji Raja also believed in, and his ministers also wanted. So there was a chance that had to be taken, because if this chance was given up, if Shivaji Maharaj were defeated in front of Afzal Khan, then we don't know when the next chance is going to come. May never have come after, I don't know.
So it was the Hindavi Swaraj which sort of brought all these Maratha Sardars together. Anish, in Maratha warfare, the forts have a very important place, and we know that a lot of fort building activity was undertaken by Shivaji as well. And it's not as if there were no forts before that. So why were forts so important, and what was so different about Shivaji's management of the forts versus others? So how did he use it to his advantage?
As you said, the forts preceded Shivaji Maharaj by quite a few years, maybe centuries. In fact, talking about Devgiri earlier, that also was a fort, what is today called Daulatabad Fort near Aurangazeb. Forts are important for various reasons, defense mainly, defense and trade. A lot of these forts guarded important passes. For example, you have your Lohargarh Fort near Lonavala, which is over the Borghat, that is current Mumbai-Pune highway. That fort was so important that right up to 1845, we find that Lohargarh Fort was holding a British garrison and cannons and everything on it for guarding this Borghat between Pune and Mumbai. That is 1845, actually, just 7 or 8 years before the first train ran between Thane and Mumbai. So you can see the importance of forts and how late they were important. Mainly for guarding passes, forts also guarded cities. And Sahyadris and Purandar are the 2 forts which are meant to guard Pune city. As they were dispersed throughout the kingdom, the importance was for holding garrisons, holding passes, holding cities, or areas in the plain. A lot of these forts, as I mentioned, preceded Chhatrapati Shivaji. A lot of them had been built by Raja Bhoj in the 12th century earlier. Some of the changes that were brought about by Chhatrapati Shivaji were groundbreaking truly, because he brought in administrative changes. Structural changes not so much, because a lot of these forts already exist. He brought in some signal structural changes, such as opening multiple entry and exit points. So having just single entry exit point, he had devised multiple entry exit points. He saw to it that forts were operated in pairs, or saw to it that water was taken care of properly. Water and food requirements were never a problem for the forts and such. But the major changes were administration, as to how the forts were run, first of all, and it prevented the forts becoming independent fiefdoms of their own, which was very important for Swarajya to be a united entity, that people holding those fortresses do not start thinking of themselves as independent kings, which is what had been happening earlier, that these warlords, they were in their fortresses, very strong in their fortresses, but very independent among themselves. So, situation was very similar actually to the tribes on the northwest frontier, Afghan tribes, where they are constantly warring against each other, but they will not allow anyone else to control them. And that sort of situation had to be prevented by Chhatrapati Shivaji and build them into a comprehensive nation, which is what he achieved by bringing about administrative changes changes. He saw to it that there were no hereditary politics on fort. He appointed Killedars, appointed their Sarnobats, etc., etc. But all the family politics were taken out. You cannot succeed your father as a Killedar of the fort. That was simply taken out. There were frequent transfers. Caste was an important part of life, and he saw to it that there was a good mixture of caste on any fort. You'll find right from the hills and Ramoshis who guarded the frontiers of that fort to the accountant who was a Brahmin. All kinds of castes were there in the fort. This prevented kind of it gave egalitarian approach to the whole subject. Second, it prevented people from combining together because of their common caste or some kind of logic on that part. Then, more importantly, when he saw that the clash with the Mughals is inevitable from the last decade of his life, it was obvious that Aurangzeb is one day going to come and attack his kingdom. He set aside reserve funds for not only building the forts but also reserve funds for each fort so that it could locally recruit. So he made the forts self-sufficient in their own right, that if an invasion happens and it's not possible to run from one fort to another or run from one fort to the capital to secure funds and men, you have your own resources ready to fight. And I believe it is more to his visionary thinking that he could keep reserve funds for men, materials, everything ready 10 years before the Mughals actually attacked.
Wow, so Shivaji was not just a master war strategist, but he was a master administrator as well. Like a lot of things that we speak about, I mean, they are relevant today as they were then, right? So very, very progressive already, if I can use that word, that Shivaji was. Anish, so after the Battle of Pratapgad, we know that the Mughals attacked anyways. The Mughals had already come, they attacked. And actually, Shivaji lost a lot of his forts in the Treaty of Purandar. And then just a few years after, he routed Aurangzeb's army and captured everything back. This is the war of Salhe that you have mentioned. Can you tell us a little bit more about the battle itself and what happened like in those 5 years that Shivaji went from losing everything to gaining everything back and completely routing the Mughal army?
Right, so he lost everything in the Treaty of Purandar. Aurangzeb then sent, after Pratapgad, you find the episode of Shaista Khan, and Shaista Khan's thumb gets cut and gets sent away. Aurangzeb isn't happy with all these happenings. He sends Diler Khan and Mirza Raji Jaisi, who are arguably his two best generals. They bring lots and lots of weapons and men to the Deccan plateau, and it's impossible to hold out against such a huge army for Chhatrapati Shivaji. So he decides that surrender is the best option for now, because otherwise the option is to lose all his forts one by one, and that would be the end of the story. So he gives up 23 forts, goes to Agra to meet Aurangzeb, escapes from there, comes back. From this point, obviously he's thinking in terms of how to get these forts back. He starts building his army. Few events take place during this, especially 1668, 1669, because we find that the attack on Sahyadris by Tanaji happens in February 1670. One is in 1668, the Mughal governor in Aurangabad isn't the most sincere fellow, is Prince Muazzam. In 1669, we find that Aurangzeb passes his famous edict to demolish temples all across India, in which immediately we find Kashi Vishwanath temple is demolished along with others. And secondly, early 1670, we find the Mathura temple also being demolished. So this Kashi Vishwanath temple demolition actually has a huge effect across North India. We find not only Shivaji, but even Chhatrasar Bundela is put out by this whole act. We find somebody like Gokula Jat rises in rebellion against Aurangzeb in Agra, and finally he is put to death by Aurangzeb. So there is a religious anger also to it. And now what is the plan? Because Aurangzeb had started demolishing temples in North India. And 1670, early 1670, Chhatrapati Shivaji opens this campaign against the Mughals, and it starts with Sinhagad. It starts with Sinhagad, and one by one all these forts start falling. There is an attack on Surat also, and then finally there is an attack on Salher, which is a fort in Maharashtra, north of Nashik. Very strategically important, because from this point, the routes from north can be guarded, the route towards Gujarat can be guarded, the routes towards east towards Nagpur can be guarded. Marathas get hold of it. And the Battle of Salher is actually about breaking the siege that the Mughals have put around the Salher fort. Up to that point of time, it is still believed that Chhatrapati Shivaji, for all his acumen and military skills, is still dependent on the hills and forests for victory. He cannot fight in the open field, is what the general belief is. And that's why once the Mughals have surrounded Salher fort, it's thought that just a matter of time before Salher once again goes back into the Mughals' kitty. And if that happens, then obviously a big ripple and demoralizing effect on the entire Maratha army. Salher, which they have taken from the Mughals, again falls, because it's a very strategically important fort. The Marathas managed to break the siege. The siege of Salher, Battle of Salher is about the Maratha armies being able to break the siege of a fort from outside by fighting a battle on the open field, which they are thought totally incapable of fighting. At a time when they are outnumbered 2-1. And Shivaji Maharaj armies under Pratapgad, Gujar and Moroccan Pillai managed to achieve this. They fight for 12 hours on the battlefield, and some around 10,000 people get killed that day. And it's a resounding win for Shivaji Maharaj. It's one of the best battles fought by Shivaji Maharaj armies, and it once again cements his position in Maharashtra as somebody who can really influence the politics of this part of the country.
Wow. So before we continue, I must tell our viewers that Aneesh has been talking about a lot of forts and a lot of places. One of the best things about the book is that he has small maps which list out, which show where these places are, which show where the forts are. And I think he's also added photos of his own travels to trekking over these forts. So do pick up the book and do check out the places also that he's talking about. Anyways, going forward, Anish, after Shivaji's death, there was a 27-year of war of Marathas with the Mughals, where Marathas fought for 27 years till Aurangzeb finally died. He gave up. He died a man who had lost against the Marathas. So, what was it in the Marathas that made them go on for 27 years? And it was not as if it was only one leadership. Sambhaji was led them. He died. Then it was Rajaram. Then it was Tarabai. So what is it that kept them going, and what are some of the interesting events, milestones that happened during this 27 years?
This 27-year war is very interesting phase of Maratha history and Indian history, because for these 25 years, Aurangzeb was totally 25 to 27 years. The battles actually started in 1680 when some Mughal commander, I think Bahadur Khan Kokaltash, first attacked a fort called Ivangarh near Nashik, just 2 or 3 months after the passing away of Chhatrapati Shivaji. And it was only in 1682 that Aurangzeb finally managed to cross Burhanpur and come south. He was busy somewhere in northwest India, around Peshawar. Anyhow, when this invasion happened, first thing, the Marathas are aware that this invasion is going to happen for sure at some point of time, because Aurangzeb had made his desire to expand the Mughal kingdom into South India very clear for the past 20-25 years. Second reason was that his own son had rebelled against him. His name was Akbar, and this Akbar had rebelled and come down south along with Durgadas Rathod to join Chhatrapati Sambhaji, and they all believe that this whole thing might combine together and pose a real challenge to the Mughal Empire. So this was the reason also, but not such a major one, because Aurangzeb was still a very powerful ruler in his own right. And all these reasons put together, he got himself down here. The next 10 years were spent by Chhatrapati Shivaji in trying to combat the Mughal army. So Chhatrapati Shivaji fought on various fronts at the same time. So the passing of Chhatrapati Shivaji, there were general belief around that now this kingdom can again be broken apart. But Chhatrapati Shivaji didn't allow that to happen. In fact, he fought around 100 battles. I have given the list in my book, Battle of the Maratha Empire. The list of battles fought during the reign of Chhatrapati Shivaji has been given. He fought against the Portuguese, he fought against the Siddhi of Janjira, he fought against the Mughals. And all put together in his 10 years, at least 90 battles have been fought. I could list 90 skirmishes, battles, everything. There could be more. I can 15, 20 up down can easily be the case. But 90 with name, with exactly who was fighting whom, can be noted from. So it is a lot of battles to fight. Many of them, Chhatrapati Shivaji himself participated. During this period, we find that in 1686, the Adil Shah of Bijapur was finished by Aurangzeb. That is, the dynasty got to a complete end. 1688, we find that the Qutub Shah of Golconda, that is Hyderabad, was also finished by Aurangzeb. So these two Muslim kingdoms of South India, Adil Shah and Qutub Shah, were finished in the sense that they did not find any trace of them after them in history. And this was done by Aurangzeb in the late 17th century. In spite of this happening, Chhatrapati Shivaji survived. The smallest of the three kingdoms still survived beyond all this. And then Aurangzeb finally managed to get hold of Chhatrapati Shivaji in 1689. That after having defeated Adil Shah and Qutub Shah, this fellow still fighting against me did not sit well with him. And he wanted to make an example out of Chhatrapati Shivaji, because this had precedents earlier also, where rulers had been caught and killed and paraded before their people so as to demoralize them. We find in the Battle of Talikota, where Ramdev Raya, the Vijayanagar king, he had been captured, he was beheaded, and water was poured through his throat from the head, And this was all put on a big spear somewhere and displayed to the entire army, and the army despaired and ran in all 4 directions. So, and this kind of tactic has been used multiple times in multiple cases, where you demoralize the army, the enemy army, by doing this kind of, horrendous activity. So the same thing was tried with Chhatrapati Shivaji, where he was made to wear a clown's costume, first of all, and paraded through the streets. Then he was tortured in various ways. His eyes were put out, his tongue was cut, and he was in starved for about 15 days. Finally, he was beheaded, and the head was taken around to all the principal towns in Maharashtra. So I have to show the people that this is what we have done to your Chhatrapati. So now your option is to surrender. The opposite happened. Whatever factionalism, whatever enmity was there between the Marathas during the reign of Chhatrapati Shivaji finished, because they knew that this is the main problem there, the Mughal Empire. And they all came together. Some very important but unknown decisions that were taken around this time. One was that Chhatrapati Shivaji had a son who was 6 years old, and technically speaking, he was one meant for the throne. But his own mother, that is Yasubai, she decided this is not the time when we have a 6-year-old on the throne and somebody ruling as a regent. We need somebody who can actually take decisions. Somebody older, and the only option left was a 19-year-old named Chhatrapati Rajaram, who was Shivaji's brother. And it is to Yasubai's credit and the Marathas' credit that they elevated Chhatrapati Rajaram instead of Chhatrapati Shahu at this point of time. Then we find that Chhatrapati Rajaram escapes to Jinji, where he again fights back against the Mughals. Jinji is an outpost established by Chhatrapati Shivaji earlier in 1670s. He fights for 10 more years. He has two able commanders, one is Santaji Ghorpade, Dhanaji Jadhav. These two, again, the list of battles can be found. I think about 120 or 130 battles can be seen in that list by them all across South India, and they completely demoralized the Mughal armies by these battles. Finally, Chhatrapati Rajaram also dies in 1700, and now Chhatrapati Shahu has been actually taken to the Mughal camp by Aurangazeb at the end of all this. When he kills Chhatrapati Shivaji and he takes Raigad, he takes Chhatrapati Shahu with him to the Mughal camp. So now what to be done? Because Chhatrapati Rajaram also doesn't exist anymore. So the mantle passes to his wife, who is 26 years old, Maharani Tarabai, and she actually leads the Maratha forces for the next 7 years against the Mughals, and takes back all that has been lost by them over the course of the past 10-15 years. And that's how the battle and the war ends, by Aurangzeb dead in Ahmednagar and most of the territory regained by the Marathas.
This is mind-blowing, absolutely mind-blowing. So after Aurangzeb's death, what happens to the Mughal Empire? I think Mughal Empire has just become very titular at that time, right? So what is then the strategy of the Maratha Empire? Because now they have control over a large part beyond just Maharashtra, this Maharashtra area, all the way up to the north. So what was the strategy that they employed to consolidate their power? Because I think the Britishers, or rather the Battle of Panipat, happens only after 50 years. So what happens during that time? We know that there is Bajirao Peshwa and there are others. So what are the key events that happened in those 50 years till the Battle of Panipat?
So when Aurangzeb dies in 1707, we find that the Mughal army almost immediately start retreating out of Maharashtra wherever they are. They all start heading back to Delhi. For two reasons. One is that there is now going to be a succession contest as to who is going to succeed, because Aurangzeb's progeny has all died. He has lived to 92, which is a very long age to live even in modern times, and in those times it was an exceptional long age, 92 or 93 years of age. In fact, his own son Akbar, who has rebelled against him, precedes his death by about 2-3 years in Iran. So there's succession dispute to take care of. Secondly, nobody is interested in fighting this war anymore because it's taken one entire generation of Mughals and Marathas out in just warfare. So this army started going ahead towards Delhi. But Marathas on their part, also, it's not a very rosy situation, because their entire land, that is, entire Deccan, has been facing warfare for the past 25-26 years. The whole generation has been going to warfare. The situation is such that there is not a single house anywhere in Maharashtra where a person doesn't know how to wield a sword and ride a horse, or actually hasn't taken part in a battlefield somewhere, on some or the other side. So they need to rebuild. And historians have debated the validity of the decision, but what the Marathas do, that is the Chhatrapati Shahu, obviously, Chhatrapati Shahu is then set free or escapes from the Mughal camp, comes to Maharashtra. Then there is a bit of succession dispute there also, but finally he becomes Chhatrapati, and he appoints his Peshwa, Balaji Vishwanath, who is the father of Peshwa Bajirao. And Chhatrapati Shahu then sends him to Delhi to obtain a sanad for the 6 provinces of Deccan, to recognize from the Mughal emperor that the 6 provinces of the Deccan, that is Aurangabad, Bijapur, Hyderabad, Golconda, all these, everything south of the Narmada belongs to the Marathas. Is what they want on pen and paper, stamp and sign of the Mughal emperor, that this is now given to you for taxation purpose. It achieves stability on this side of the Narmada in South India, where the Chhatrapati Shahu decided that he wants to stabilize the kingdom first. In around 1720, 1721, about 1 or 2 years only after this decision, we find Peshwa Bajirao makes an announcement. He said that he makes the announcement, but whatever this decision had been taken, that the Marathas should now move north, because in South India, we'll be keeping ourselves busy in this part of the country. South India, anyways, they have given to us in their taxation, and it's a very important thing, the taxation clause. Once you get taxation rights, it more or less means you get any and all rights. This is exactly what the British achieved from the Mughal Emperor in 1757. He got Diwani rights on Bengal, which is what taxation rights, and all other rights and privileges flow from this, the right to tax. If you take away the right to tax, I mean, if you take away the right to tax Maharashtra or right to tax Gujarat, then that's it. When nothing else is going after that. The vice versa, if somebody has taxation rights, then everything else flows from that point on. So he says that already we have taxation rights, we have South and South, there should be rights over these 6 provinces. Forget this, we now have North, because the Mughals have become weak, and everything North also belongs to us now. That is how Peshwa Bajirao starts going northwards, and then we have a series of spectacular battles fought by him against various powers. The Nizam is a problem, because Nizam establishes the Hyderabad Nizam is actually a breakaway faction from the Mughal Empire. There is a person known as Chin Khan, who has been sent as part of these armies of Aurangazeb during that great 27-year war. And this Chin Khan establishes himself in what is today's Andhra Pradesh, around Hyderabad. And eventually then this grows to become the Nizam of Hyderabad. That is a bit of a problem which keeps popping up every now and then. And some of what Peshwa Bajirao's greatest achievement, one Palkhed, second Bhopal, is that it relegates the Nizam of Hyderabad to a regional power status. So he wants to actually control Malwa and central India and become a major arbitrator of national politics, the Nizam of Hyderabad. But Peshwa Bajirao, by his victories at Palkhed and Bhopal, manages to make him a regional power, keep him limited to Hyderabad, and it is the Marathas who governed this crucial area between Bundelkhand to Narmada, Chambal and Narmada, and eventually Yamuna and Narmada, which then make them the arbitrator of the politics in India. So this is what goes on to 1740. His son, Balaji Bajirao, continues this policy, and they keep expanding. You have somebody like Raghuji Bhosle, who on his own right expands towards Cuttack and Orissa, and this expansion goes on and on till 1758, when they finally manage to cross Attock and Peshawar. And it is obvious that a clash is now going to happen between them and Ahmad Shah Abdali, who is also a capable ruler who started from Kandahar, and he has now built an empire which is now stretches from what is today's Amur Darya in Uzbekistan all the way up to Sirhind in today's India. So more or less India and Pakistan combined. Afghanistan and Pakistan combined, territorially speaking. So these two large kingdoms are going to clash at some point of time, and they do clash at the Battle of Panipat in 1761.
So the Battle of 1760, as in the Panipat battle, is quite spoken of, because I think Abdali won and the Marathas lost. So what was the impact of that loss on the Maratha Empire? And then was that why eventually, when the Britishers came, had they been weakened so much after the Battle of Panipat that they couldn't hold off against the British? Or how does it progress after that?
So you see, this misconception created that the Marathas were defeated to such an extent in Panipat that was the end of their story. But that is not the case. First of all, the Panipat defeat, what it did was simply limit the Marathas to what their borders were at that point of time. If they had won Panipat, then obviously two things would happen. One is that they were expanded very fiercely to Punjab on one side. And secondly, they would have gone from Delhi towards Calcutta. In fact, you find a letter in 1759, that is just 1 or 2 years prior to Panipat. In fact, it is December of 1759, that late, where you find the Peshwa has written to Dattaji Shinde that he has to go into Awadh, take control of the holy places, that is Prayag and Banaras and Gaya, and after that, with or without the help of the Nawab of Awadh, move into Bengal, that is British ruled Bengal. They've been only about 2 years. So that one plan is set in motion, which have been arrested by the Panipat battle. The Afghans on their own side, it's a Pyrrhic victory, because Abdali doesn't survive much after that, 5, 7 years, 10 years after that, but he doesn't expand his kingdom. He doesn't invade to such an extent anymore, because he faces a lot of loss of manpower and equipment in that Panipat. In fact, if you go through that, it's surprising to find that Abdali makes a great effort to stop the battle from happening. And it is Najib-ud-Dawla who actually presses him on and on and on and gets the battle done, because Najib knows that he is next in the firing line if the Marathas win. And Abdali's aim is to prevent a great slaughter of his own men, because he has a very fragile kingdom to take care of. As it so happens, the battle takes place and great victory is scored by the Afghans. From this point, I believe that the Marathas began a decline. It's not true. One thing is that we find somebody like Peshwa Madhavrao comes only 2 years afterwards, 1763, again defeats the Nizam of Hyderabad in the Battle of Rakshasmohan, which is again I've covered in Battle of the Maratha Empire. And he stamps his authority in South India. It's taken seriously once again. It's believed that once the Panipat debacle happened, the Maratha kingdom is going to fall apart, but that doesn't happen, mainly because of Peshwa Madhavrao, who defeats Hyder Ali also in various battles in Karnataka. He defeats in Nizam Hyderabad, and he also has the time and patience and intelligence to bring about administrative changes in Pune, such as establishing a police department, which is in fact the police department that the present police will trace themselves to in the 18th century. At the same time, we find similar Maharji Shinde manages to take back a lot of Maratha territory which have been lost in North India. The Marathas reinstate themselves in Delhi. There is a letter of 1771 where the Mughal emperor is lamenting to his wazir. Mughal emperor escapes to Allahabad. First thing he goes there to fight against the British Empire at Buxar. Then he gets defeated. Then he sits at Allahabad only because Delhi is in the hands of first Najib-ud-Dawla and then the Marathas. As long as Najib-ud-Dawla is there, it's fine. But the moment the Marathas take control of Delhi, he writes a letter to his wazir that the faithless Marathas were taken hold of Delhi and are doing a bandobast of the city. This is 1771 under Maharji Shinde. And so we find that the political imprint is still there in North India and South India throughout 1770s, 80s. Hyderabad workers' activities are all taking place in this era. Right up to 1795, we find that the Marathas can combine their armies and face a common enemy. We find at the Battle of Kharada in 1795. Problems start happening from 1795, just about that same year. There are institutional problems, you can say. The kind of armies that the Marathas are building and the kind of armies that the British are building are two different things. We find that even after rebuilding themselves, they find themselves being defeated by the British in a very short span of time. We find in 1803 when the campaign opens against the Maratha Empire by the British, and about 5-6 years later it's done. So the entire Maratha Empire has been followed by the British Empire. So why is there such a short span of time that the empire falls? Of course, there is a bit of fighting happening in 1818, but for all practical purposes, 1803 is a time when the Shindes get defeated. The Holkars also get defeated very soon after that. One problem was that the armies that are being produced by the British Empire were far more professional. The Maratha armies were not being produced as professionally as before. Chhatrapati Shivaji's army were extremely professional in that they were salaried armies that did not live off the land. They were getting money from the treasury. Maratha armies had gone more into mercenary kind of forces. They had put a lot of faith in foreigners to train their soldiers and man their artillery mainly. And so the entire leadership of the Marathas in the later part of the 18th century had become European. No matter which Maratha ruler you turn to, whether the Shindes or the Holkars or the Gaikwad, their top leadership of the artillery and infantry were always Europeans, especially French. And this entire leadership deserted them in the time of crucial battles such as Laswari and Delhi. In fact, this is more or less the week that the British, the 1803, British General Lake took Delhi from the Marathas in 1803. And one of the reasons was that the French commanders who were supposed to command the Marathas simply ran away at the sign of this contest. So they were bright, but the Marathas failed to realize that the British actually had a better army, more professional armies. The Marathas depended too much on their European or French, in fact, in some cases, Scott and Irish officers on the battlefield. That was one of the macro reasons that when the actual battles took place, such as at Laswari and at Delhi, it was the leadership crisis which created a problem. Why was this such a problem? Why would 2 or 3 people in the battlefield create so much of an issue? Is that warfare had changed drastically in the later part of the 18th century, and leadership had become a very, very important facet. Till that time, when people were fighting mainly with swords and knives, warfare was about individual contests. You went into war and then you fought your enemy with a sword and then either he died or you died. Only two options. But the Industrial Revolution and the musket drill and firing in groups, what it meant was the leadership became more important. That entire units of 50 people, 60 people could work like one common weapon if they had the correct leadership to guide them. And when they did not have that leadership, then it became a very difficult situation for these kind of people to work properly. In spite of that, the Marathas fought very bravely, and here by the term Marathas, I mean the Maratha army as it was in 1803. And Laswari, in fact, which is near Alwar, The battle is rated by the British themselves as one of the toughest that they fought in the Indian subcontinent throughout their rule over here. And this battle was fought by a Maratha army that combined Rajputs, Jats, some Sikhs, some Muslims, some converted Christians, and native Marathi speakers. Only about 2 to 3,000 of them in an army of 12,000, of which around 6 or 7,000 died or were injured in that battle. So these are the macro models. And when actual fighting came down to leadership, they did not have this in hand. Secondly, the problem was a divide and rule perpetuated by the British Empire, where they ensured that the various constituents of the Maratha Empire fought against each other rather than combining against the British, which is very surprising. You find that in 1795 they had stood together against the Nizam of Hyderabad. But in 1803, the Peshwa Bajirao had already sided with the British, surrendered to the British so that he would get their help against Yashwantrao Holkar, who had attacked Pune city. And he had attacked Pune city because the Peshwa had sentenced to death Vithoji Holkar, whose brother, because of some conflict happening in Malwa. The Sindhi or Sindhis were supposed to be allies of the Peshwa. So this was the kind of mess that had been created in 1803 between the Peshwa Bajirao, Yashwantrao Holkar and Dolatrao Sindhia. So when the British declared war against the Marathas, we find that the Bhosles of Nagpur and the Sindhis of Gwalior were the only two who combined against them. The Holkars, that is Yashwantrao Holkar, stayed away from this contest. Peshwa Bajirao did not take part in it, and the Gaikwads of Baroda also stayed away from the contest. As a result, they had to face the Marathas only at Asai and Adgaon in Maharashtra and Delhi and Raswari in North India. Then Yashwantrao Holkar opposed them from 1804 once this one part of the confederacy had been taken care of. Yashwantrao Holkar opposed them valiantly for 5-6 years, but again he also was defeated because the going turned against him eventually, because in which direction was the pushed to them. The British had already signed a peace treaty with the Sikhs in Punjab. They defeated Sindhia, they defeated Nagpur Bhosles, and it was a matter of time before the Holkars got defeated. Then Peshwa Bajirao decided to finally fight the British in 1818, already 15 years since this second Anglo-Maratha war had taken place. And it was really a case of bolting the door when the horse was already bolted. So a combination of not having the correct leadership in battles, actual battles, and divide and rule policy of the British that caused the Maratha downfall. Here actually I make 2 points. One is the misconception that it was technological superiority of the English that allowed them to win, which is not true. The newer edition of the book, which has now come out, I have mentioned actual statements of Arthur Wellesley and a couple of English soldiers or officers who fought during those times, who have actually mentioned the kind of weapons that the Marathas had, and they were of the latest technology available. And Wellesley in fact says that he would happily take the Maratha arsenal into his own army. Is of that quality. Interestingly, they also mentioned that how the Marathas were manufacturing their guns on the French design. They were having the latest improvements, all being given by the French to them. So technologically, they were obviously on the correct path. And it was a leadership problem that really led to defeat, and not technological problems as such. Because having technology and using technology are two totally different things. Second interesting thing is why did the British risk this whole business of fighting against the Marathas? One thing is fine that the Marathas were fighting among themselves, but what was the reasons for the British to poke their finger into this problem? The British were actually spooked by the French gaining too much influence in the Indian subcontinent. And as I say that a flutter of a butterfly creates a storm halfway around the world. We find Napoleon Bonaparte has taken Egypt in around 1798, 1799, and he holds what is now Suez Canal, but at the time an overland route near Suez, which is the trade route from India for England, and something that the British simply cannot tolerate, that Napoleon is holding their cards to India. And the next step, which the British truly feared, was Napoleon coming to India and helping all these Indian powers get rid of British influence altogether. And this was their reasons behind opening this campaign, which was on paper suicidal, simply oppose the Maratha Confederacy and declare war against all of them. But from their point of view, this was the situation that the French were gaining too much influence, and which is why the Second Anglo-Maratha War had to take place.
Fantastic. And just in like an hour, you have covered 150 years of Maratha history. I will end with just one last question, and this is not so much about the contents, but your motivation to write this book about Maratha history. What led you to write this book, and why Maratha history? Why do you think it's so important for us to know the Maratha history now?
There's one narrative that the British took India from the Mughals. It was the Mughal Empire and then followed by the British Empire. There was an entire century in between the 18th century, which was dominated by the Maratha Empire. It means that the Mughal Empire eclipsed by the Marathas and they were in turn defeated by the British through a series of battlefield contests and not simply diplomacy or all that sort, or actual battlefield defeats and deaths happening on the battlefield before India passed to the British. So this is one reason. Secondly, although a lot has been written on Maratha history, I felt that a book that would really touch upon the important facets of this era, right from Chhatrapati Shivaji down to the last Peshwa Bajirao, was missing. If I want to suggest a book on Maratha history, then I would suggest this book because it will cover everything of importance. There have been books written, but most of them are about singular personalities, about, say, Peshwa Bajirao, there is one book, and Chhatrapati Shivaji, there is one book. And if you want to suggest, read Maratha history and suggest somebody read the whole of G.S. Sardesai, then to read 8 volumes is a bit too much. So instead of that, a single volume, which will take care of most of Maratha history. Is there any curious? Apart from this, I have got 2 anecdotes which really propelled, inspired me to go ahead with the whole project instead of just thinking about it. One is a trek that I had done with school kids about 5 or 6 years earlier. They were 6th or 7th standard kids, and I gone to a fort nearby near Pune. One of these kids comes to me and says, I can name the 6 Muslim kings of India. And then he announces everybody from Babur to Aurangazeb. Babur, Humayun, Akbar, Jahangir, Shah Jahan, Aurangzeb, Mughal, right? So then I asked him, okay, do you know Chhatrapati Shivaji? They say, yes, yes, I know. Fortunately, I heard about Chhatrapati Shivaji. I'm glad. But anyway, then I asked him, okay, can you name his 2 sons? That is Chhatrapati Sambhaji, Chhatrapati Rajaram. And he absolutely clueless about this. And you can't really blame him because that's how the, this is. The school curriculum is. Second incident happened, I mentioned I'm in Merchant Navy officer. At that time I was a cadet. I was talking to my chief officer. I'm from Sri Lanka, and something had happened back then in India, where you find that some controversy happening about Chhatrapati Shivaji at the same time. So I asked me, why is Chhatrapati Shivaji so great? Why is he very great? I mean, India don't need to explain why is he great. But now he's Sri Lankan, he has to explain why is he great. In Sri Lanka, nobody knows about Chhatrapati Shivaji. And I found myself at a loss what to explain to this fellow. Because even saying that because you defeated Mughals, it doesn't ring a bell. Because across India, you mentioned that this was done was against the Mughals, fought the Mughals, then everybody, there is somebody somewhere right from north to south to Assam who will have something positive or negative or something to connect with. But Sri Lanka is also missing. So this is where the whole thought of writing Battle of Pratapgad in a detailed manner came. That this is where his qualities, other than simply fighting the Mughals or fighting the Adil Shah Mahmud, where as a personality comes out in a universal manner, beyond any kind of borders, any kind of categorization which you have to go through before explaining his greatness. And these 2 incidents plus the whole wish that Maratha history to be combined into a single book really got me to this conclusion, and then I wrote this Battle of the Maratha Empire.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Aneesh. Thank you so much for writing this book. It's a very important book, I think, and I request all our viewers to definitely pick it up. It's available on Amazon, The Battle of the Maratha Empires by Aneesh Gokhale. Thank you so much, Aneesh. Thanks a lot.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of the Bharat Varta podcast. If you want to see more content like this, then don't forget to subscribe to our channel. We started Bharat Varta to facilitate long-form discussions on politics, policy, and culture. We don't necessarily endorse anything that was said in this episode. If you wish to offer us feedback, do reach out to us on social media. We are at Bharat Varta on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. You could also get in touch with us on our website, www.bharatvarta.in. The links are in the description below. Until next time, stay safe, take care, and Jai Hind.